I'm gonna come back to that Dante's Inferno. I want y'all to really understand the truth behind that shit too. I'm gonna give y'all something real quick. All right, I'm trying to find. I'm trying to find the. You'll see once I find the right one. It's like the right. Tell you the right one.
Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway
Yeah, I'm about
or
to go to Patreon
paypal.me
too.
/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. By demand, merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com.
I knew nothing about the American Indian, and that everything that we are taught about the American Indian is wrong. It's inaccurate. And our school books are hopelessly lacking, perhaps criminally lacking, in revealing what our relationship was with the Indian.
I'm tired. I'm really, really tired of the manipulation.
Also, what we've learned about the Indians has been largely taught to us by Hollywood and by motion pictures. They have educated us. Indians have been tragically misrepresented in films and in our history books, in our attitudes, in our reporting. So we must set about to re-educate ourselves.
They killed that man.
They manipulate our history books. The history books are not true. It's a lie. The history books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that.
When third world countries are
He
misrepresented,
died.
they're likely to be valueless.
In Turkey.
When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere, and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
When we hear, as we've heard throughout all our lives, no matter how old we are, that we are a country that stands for freedom, for
When the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere,
History books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that.
when third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valueless. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere, and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
when we hear, as we've heard throughout all our lives, no matter how old we are, that we are a country that stands for freedom, for rightness, for justice, for everyone. It simply doesn't apply to those who are not white. It just simply doesn't apply. And we were the most rapacious, aggressive, destructive, torturing, monstrous people who swept from one coast to the other, murdering and causing mayhem among the Indians. When we say, especially, that we are going to keep our treaties and that we do keep our word and that we, above all people, do keep our word, I think it's important to mention that there have been nearly 400 treaties written by the United States in good faith with the Indians, and every single one of them was abrogated. Means broken or changed or altered.
Okay, everyone. Now, in this particular segment, I will be covering many details that is, of course, very essential to all Americans, and especially to those who are the direct descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of this land, now called North America. And before I go any further, allow me to acknowledge that I do totally understand that many of you may have heard either very little to no detail at all concerning this information that I'm about to present to you, merely due to the fact that you were lied to, like millions of others, no matter if they share the same hue of complexion with you or not. In many of my previous documentaries, I've shared various detailed information that was hidden to the public as to why multiple different things were purposely told to you in reverse, which leads me to my very first point of this segment, and that is, why was history told to you in reverse? Now, this question alone will be continuously answered throughout this particular segment and also throughout nearly all of my content that I present to the public. Reason being is due to how history is depicted in today's society of America, because history today is now known as what is documented from the past, but the problem resides in what was considered to be history in the past. simply because history in the past was literally what a sole individual made it to be. Now, this generation of people would inadvertently believe that that's how history should be, and I agree with you. However, I would add that generational past history differs from, say, for example, like LeBron James making history in one of his past championship games. Why? Well, merely due to how generational past history is formatted, in which it would teach generations of people a fictitious story of unforeseen information, a one-directional, or rather one-sided story told by a particular group of people in order to establish and maintain a deceitful hidden agenda of propaganda that will manipulate its readers or listeners into a system of theology indoctrination. In other words, these particular individuals that provided this information told you what they wanted to tell you, no matter if it was based on any truths, facts, or their own opinions. It is called the illusion of power, whereas this illusion is that one group of people are somehow superior to others. What is also important to note here is that there are multiple different entities that are man-made, and history is one of them, along with various types of science, technology, and even many forms of religion. All of these social engineering experiments were cultivated by the same exact one set group of people that I mentioned earlier in order to compel the masses into adopting it. The ideology alone of their manipulative theoretical motives programs an individual to become prone with limits to their literacy and critical thinking capabilities. Not only were these same tactics utilized in the past, but these detrimental effects are currently being depicted as the norm in today's society. This form of role reversal began with Charles Darwin and his followers when they began to promote and teach the theory of evolution during the 1800s. As you may know, the theory of evolution is a scientific method in which Charles Darwin states the process of natural selection and pseudoscientific, blatantly racist information that he cultivated in relation to the world's population. Now, why would he do this? Well, it's definitely not about whether man came from monkeys, as society would love to point to you, so you can argue about this fictitious theory whenever it's brought up. No, it's more about the different traits of the human population, how different traits confer different rates of survival and reproduction, and also how these traits can be passed down from generation to generation. Now, you might be asking, so what does this have to do with our history being told to us in reverse? And my answer to that is everything. Because Charles Darwin created this theory of evolution not because of the apes, but because he was a part of it. In other words, Charles Darwin's pseudoscientific theory was used to manipulate people into believing that they evolved from apes. But in all actuality, he was endeavoring to figure out where his species of people came from. This module will go on to formulate how this particular group of collective offspring will be able to continue forward in successive generations as the quote, survival of the fittest. See, you have to understand where Europe is located. Before it was called Europe, that particular landmass was, and still is, a part of Africa. And all of this correlates with some of the many things that were told to you in reverse. Like, for example, the out of Africa theory. Now, keep in mind that I just explained to you the hidden details behind Charles Darwin's theory. And just like his theory of evolution, the entire out of Africa theory is merely nothing but an indoctrinated form of manipulative pseudo-storytelling that was cultivated by the likes of a self-proclaimed prominent but yet fictitious bigoted scientist named Melville Jean Herskovits, an anthropologist of the early 1900s. Melville is solely responsible for expanding the lies of storytelling, in which in turn it was later considered to be American history, by completely reversing the records of historic information and also creating a fictional story about African slaves immigrating to the Americas by way of the Spaniards during the 1500s. This story was later known as the Middle Passage. However, prior to Melville's fictional story, no information existed in history that clearly mentioned that the so-called Negroes of the American lands came from Africa. For example, according to an English immigrant by the name of Noah Webster, who is the author of the Webster's English Language Dictionaries, the year 1828's definition of American is, quote, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals, or copper-colored races, found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. Also, Melville allegedly took a trip to somewhere in Africa, meaning that there is absolutely no records of this, just a story, gathered up a few artifacts from there, observed a few tribes and a few cultures, and dubbed it as Africanism, then traveled back to the US, wrote a book called The Myth of the Negro Past, and published it in 1942 in the fictional section, where he claimed that the people of color in America somehow lost connection with their cultural past during the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas. See, the people like Melville and the US government, along with the US public school system, wants you to believe that the lands of America were unoccupied prior to their arrivals. But the truth is that they were occupied by our ancestors, and not these people that they are referring to as Native Americans right now. Our ancestors were not of pale skin, but only dark to light brown skin complexions. The out of Africa theory, along with these fraudulent DNA tests from the 1900s, works hand in hand for one big reason. Because they were created by the same group of people that forced you to believe that you came from Africa, when in fact, millions of these Caucasians did not arrive to North America until the late 1700s. Hence the reason why the US Census did not begin the population count until the year 1790. And all of those records between the 1790 US Census and the 1830 census were either lost or destroyed somehow. Side note, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 gave government officials the permission to destroy those records to further hide the truth about who the real African Americans are, furthering the expansion of eugenics by manipulating millions of people into believing a lie. Another example of history that was told to you in reverse is that of the world maps. Over the years, several different maps were created, the majority of them to reflect imperialism and to exacerbate the size and importance of the ruling countries.
The Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
All world maps in today's history derived from the European traditional Mercator world map of 1569, and all of these maps are royally incorrect.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But yes, it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes.
They are in fact flipped upside down and shown to you in reverse, with the current hemispheres misrepresented, meaning that it distorts the size of objects, or rather continents, and also misplaces the location of a continent's position on purpose.
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, and Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked.
This was done this way to give off the impression that the Western Europeans are superior to other races of people by being above the New World, or rather third world countries.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power. In our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power. When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere, and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the Northern Hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
This misrepresentation of history and the many ways that it has been reversed has definitely affected our people's mentality, nationality, cultures, heritage, history, and even education. So, there's no coincidence that this same one set group of racist people in America wants you to go back to Africa, all while consistently pushing the fictitious agenda into your conscious that Africa is where they immigrated your ancestors from. Because the truth is that they will want your attention on a different area of landmass for a bigger reason. And that reason is so you won't notice that America is truthfully your direct ancestors' mainland, and Africa is actually where their ancestors originally derived from, making them the real African Americans, due to the story being purposely told to you in reverse. I'm just here to make you think. Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway. Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. By demand, merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com.
I advise you to do your research without saying.
My word to all black Americans, one thing I would like to say, let's not be deceived. Look at the record. Look at the promises that have been made over the past from the Democratic Party.
On this day, that is also the bicentennial of Charles Darwin's birth. It's worth a moment to pause and renew that commitment to science and innovation and discovery that Lincoln understood so well.
So let's jump right into the next question. And it's so if we shouldn't call ourselves African Americans or black, then what should we call ourselves? And that is a very good question. All right, now if you take a look at my previous documentaries, I explained or shared rather detailed information as to the reason why you should not call yourself nor associate yourself with those dangerous terms. You are indigenous. You are indigenous to this land, not anywhere else. This land, Turtle Island, now known as North America.
Let's keep switching
the identity to hide the people. Why don't we just keep renaming you? Are you Negro? Oh, no, you're not Negro. No, you're colored. No, you're not colored. You're African American. And this is what they name you. The slavers name you this. Because I know a white guy who grew up in South Africa, and he now lives in America. He is an African American, and more African American than most. Do you see how African American is a misnomer? It's a misnomer. Don't check that box. It's a title given to blacks by democratic slaves.
Now, in today's society of America, millions of so-called African Americans are struggling to come to grips with their true identity, culture, heritage, and history, mainly due to the numerous manipulative tactics utilized to govern their critical thinking mechanisms and to also decimate their literacy capabilities. Each one of these manipulative social engineering experiments can only be detected and detached from one's subconscious when standing outside of the box. I'll let you ponder on what's happening to those that are still inside of it. Meanwhile, you have not and will not ever hear me promote any form of religion throughout any of my content that I present to the public. Reason being is due to religion, faith, and beliefs are based on one's personal relationships. And I am not here to debate nor argue about who you should or should not love. That's simply none of my business. So let's also be sure not to confuse the truth that I present throughout my content with any personal beliefs that you may have. Now, in this segment, you will learn about who you truly are and where you really came from based on truthful information. Because mind you, there is a big difference between truth and facts. Facts is merely controversial information, whereas a person bears the opinion to debate its credibility or not. That's yet another form of belief, whereas truth is non-debatable due to its credibility of always making logical sense. This is why in today's society, most people don't even care about the truth. Why? Because to them, unfortunately, a lie is more entertaining. Now, on March 1st, 1790, then President George Washington and Vice President John Adams, along with then Speaker of the House Frederick Muhlenberg, signed the 1790 Census Act. According to the census itself, it states that the 1790 Census Act is a law that, quote, required that every household be visited, that completed census schedules be posted in two of the most public places within each jurisdiction, there to remain for the inspection of all concerned, and that the aggregated amount of each description of persons for every district be transmitted to the president. So let me point out that some households, not all, were visited by these individuals entitled as census enumerators, also known as census takers, who are technically federally government unsupervised employees who allegedly went from town to town, city to city, and door to door, deciding who was of what race, and then documented the families they meet as such. So you mean to tell me that these census takers were provided instructions by way of the government to document and record the ethnic category of various family members based on their perception of the family when they visited, and their opinions were considered to be official historical records of information? Even though they did not count every individual living within the United States due to the multiple indigenous Niji raids and rebellions occurring during this time period, the alleged first official census of the entire United States was implemented on a day dubbed as Census Day, on August 2nd, 1790. See, now what's very important to note here is that the quote, free people of color were recorded all in one group. And also note that it states free and not freed, as if they were freed people from some form of enslavement. I go into full details regarding this topic at hand in my documentary called The Untold Truth about the classifications of race for African Americans. But of course I mentioned all of this for a particular reason, and that is the official 1790 U.S. Census population count was a total of 3,929,214 people. But keep in mind that this total amount did not reflect millions of people who were indigenous to North America, meaning they did not come from another continent, nor did it reflect the accurate total amount of so-called slaves in North America. Why? Well, the U.S. Census Agency themselves admitted to not possessing the majority of their official historical records of information that was allegedly documented between the 1790 U.S. Census and up to the 1830 U.S. Census. Their excuse was to claim that these records were lost or destroyed somehow. See, this was purposely done for two reasons. A, to hide the truth about the real history surrounding the U.S. in slavery. I mean, generally speaking, you can literally prove to yourself that your ancestors were slaves or not by documentation. You can check and see if your ancestors came off a boat. I have been sharing this information publicly for a few years now, along with my sources, and I still have not heard from anyone that used my directions to trace their family that I have listed in the description of this video that one of their ancestors were documented as being a former slave. The people that reached out to me that has or is currently undergoing research on their family's genealogical background have not failed with discovering that their family members were either never enslaved and has always been free, or worked as an indigent servant for money, land ownership, business ownership, etc., and considered to be freedmen once their obligations of servitude expired. Make no mistake, when you hear the word freedman from now on, freedman does not necessarily mean that he or she was freed from enslavement, because it can also mean relieved from their duties in most commonly known cases. So, this first reason to allegedly lose or destroy these records were to hide the truth that it was a very small amount of copper-colored slaves and a greater amount of prisoners of war in North America. And the second reason is, B, to hide the truth about who are the real minority and majority in terms of the population count here in the United States of America. Which brings me to my very next point. If you are still watching, congratulations. You are now about to be made cognizant of one of the biggest reasons why I'm just here to make you think. Listen closely. The biggest portion of their hidden agenda was the abominable sabotaging of indigenous people's history, legacy, languages, culture, heritage, systematically. Of course, they couldn't pull this task off on their own, so they implemented a methodology format based solely on the scientific concepts of eugenics. According to the National Archives, the term eugenics was coined by a British natural scientist and explorer named Francis Galton in the year of 1883. Now, there are two sides to every coin, so I'll flip each side over to uncover its hidden agendas. And by the way, I'm not theoretically speaking. Eugenics was implemented to help improve one selected group of people and their future generations to come, to overtake and oversee yet another set group of people and their future generations, by way of extermination of their mindsets only. This rabbit hole goes much deeper than one may assume. Allow me to simplify the explanation of this paramount method utilized by the likes of our governmental industrialized institutions throughout America still to this very day. Eugenics literally changes everything that any person was ever taught of or even thought of previously before this selection was carried out upon him or her. Now, according to Francis Galton, this system would allow, quote, more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable, end quote. Galton was heavily influenced by the likes of an English naturalist, biologist, and the first ever self-proclaimed documented bigoted genealogist, famously known by the name of Charles Darwin. Darwin single-handedly developed the controversial theory surrounding human specimen and the system of natural selection. And of course, Darwin did so with racial motives and derogative intentions. During the early 1900s, the social engineering aspect of Darwin's theory became popular worldwide amongst many scientists alike, high-ranking politicians, and it even caught the eye of the elitists, the most powerful globalists to ever exist in modern times. More about this in the second installment concerning this topic, but I mention all of this to inform you that they all played a prominent role in elevating the advancement of eugenics, specifically for the sake of their own race, disguised as if this was for the benefit of all humanity at a cost of whatever they desire. They were religiously following this formula or rule by dubbing it as, quote, survival of the fittest. In other words, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was merely a way to elevate and escalate the implementation of white supremacy and to eradicate those who were of non-pale complexions, deeming it as survival of the fittest, where those who did not meet their racist criterias, motives, and agendas would suffer from a variety of forms of propaganda that was hypothesized to eliminate the opposing race of people. See, eugenics is literally a modernized pseudoscience that is based merely on racial discrimination and environmental injustice socially, physically, and mentally, but became prosperous still due to its popularity of praises from those who gravitated towards inequality and racial estrangement. Now, with all of that being said, I'm going to use the title of an article that I created back in 2016 that went viral and accumulated 7 million views in 2 months. And nearly every website known to man was copying and pasting my article on their website for views and, of course, ad revenue. And the title is 98% of African Americans are in fact Native Indians and are owed millions. Now, you might be saying, well, Dane, what about the other 2%? The other 2% will be the very, very small amount of Africans. Now, of course, I'm about to give you truthful information about this before it somehow disappears from the internet, because this rabbit hole is in fact much deeper than one may assume. Listen closely. On the date of September 25th, 2008, in a statement made before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs by Representative James P. Morin, on the grounds of the Thomasina E. Jordan Indian Tribes of Virginia Federal Recognition Act, Morin stated, quote, "This is a travesty this committee can correct. The second unique circumstance for Virginia tribes is what they experienced at the hands of the state government during the first half of the 20th century. It has been called a paper genocide. At a time when the federal government granted Native Americans the right to vote, Virginia's elected officials adopted racially hostile laws targeted at those classes of people who did not fit into the dominant white society. The fact that some of Virginia's ruling elite claimed to be blood descendants of Pocahontas in their view meant that no one else in Virginia could make a claim they were Native American and a descendant of Pocahontas' people. With the great hypocrisy, Virginia's ruling elite pushed policies that culminated with the enactment of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This act directed state officials and zealots like Walter Pleckler to destroy state and local courthouse records and reclassify in Orwellian fashion all non-whites as colored. It targeted Native Americans with a vengeance, denying Native Americans in Virginia their identity. To call yourself a Native American in Virginia was to risk a jail sentence of up to 1 year. Now, in this statement, he used the term Native American, but the truth is that our identities were changed not from Native American, but from Indian to colored. And they were not only jailing people in Virginia for claiming their true identity, they were killing them by hanging them from a tree, and in more ways than just one that I won't mention, in each state across North America. The biggest bigoted racist white supremacist of them all, and that's including the federal government and all of those who praise this coward's derogative motives and agenda, was none other than Walter Ashby Pleckler.
The Plecker era was truly one of the darkest times for Native people in Virginia. But I think it's critical for us to think about what was the genesis of the ideology that Plecker was a proponent of. And it's really the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a pseudo-scientific movement. We say pseudo-scientific today because we find that the science that they were proposing is not what we today would honor as scientific in any way. The eugenics movement has a direct link to the descendants of Charles Darwin. They somehow made the leap to these notions about racial purity. What is best for each race is racial purity. Plecker and his friends convinced the Virginia legislature to adopt very restrictive legislation in 1924. It's called the Racial Integrity Act. With this legislation, it was decreed that there were only two possible categories. One is white, which means a person, you check that you're white if you have white ancestry, Caucasian ancestry, and absolutely nothing else. The other category is everybody else, and that's colored. So this was very hard on Virginia's indigenous community because in a sense it wipes away in the state of Virginia until 1968 when the U.S. Supreme Court forced Virginia to repeal the law.
Keep in mind that our elder family members' birth certificates were changed multiple times to state colored, Negro, mulatto, Creole, or even black as their classifications of racial identity by way of the federal government systematically. So, the moral of this segment is that you have been lied to by your government, your president and politicians, your school teachers, your public school history programs, your college professors, multiple Out of Africa theory books, and even inadvertently or purposely, people that shares the same hue as you and I. And that's a whole nother story within itself. Now I challenge each and every one of you to seriously research your mother, or your grandmother, or your great-grandmother's birth certificates. And if it has the letter C, or COL dot, or colored, and every other misclassified title of race that I just mentioned, then at that moment, you will know the absolute truth about who you really are. I'm just here to make you think.
Ooh, yeah. Hear that? You hear that? I know you hear that. Now you see what I say. Stop calling me the African American. Stop. Stop what I'm from. Stop what I'm from. I'm not saying all white folk is from Europe or even South Africa. See, we're so used to seeing our people in Gucci. And you go to places like Virginia, West V, uh, New Mexico, shit like that. This is the black people you gonna see. You not gonna. I mean, you will see a few that's in hoodies and shit, but majority of them dress like this. Like Kyrie be going to the conventions and shit that our people be hosting. I don't know. I ain't never ran across one. There's another thing too. When I said it before we spoke English.
What do you want here, Lassie?
You.
I'm sorry, lass. I'm a married man. I meant it. I have a wife.
Are you... You're Jamie Fraser, aren't you?
I am. Who asks? Have you a message for me, lass?
My name is Brianna. I'm your daughter.
Brianna. Is it true? It's you.
It's me.
Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. Merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com.
I like that man intro, that shit, boy. All day, man.
Oseo, my brothers and sisters, relatives, spiritual warriors, and free thinkers. Today, I want to begin this segment with you imagining yourself traveling to a different location that you may want to go. But this particular location will be very distant from your current home, meaning that it will be located in a totally different country, where the people of that country would speak their native language, which of course will be different from yours. The people of this particular country would look different, think different, and even eat different foods from what you would normally intake back home. Their customs and traditions are also different, along with their dates and times. And even the weather of this place is under different atmospheric conditions from what you would normally experience back home. Imagine that you have never traveled to this place previously, nor even seen or heard of this place before, but you travel to this distant location still in hopes of providing a better present for yourself and maybe a better future for your family. And let me add that in order for you to live there, you will have to learn from scratch a totally new culture and a new way of life, and most importantly, possibly a new trade. In fact, the only way for you to survive in this new location is to learn how to communicate efficiently and effectively enough to conduct trade, so that you can now have a job or run a business and begin to somehow make an income in this foreign land. Sounds difficult, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. Even right now, with the availability of the internet and possibly having assistance from foreign interpreters at your expense, realistically, this would in fact be a difficult task for anyone to succeed in without the proper connections. Now, with you cognizant of how difficult it would be for you to do this sort of thing today, think about how complex this sort of thing would be if a person attempted this same exact thing at least 100 or more years ago without having the luxury of advanced technology, which should make you ask some questions. Like, was there ever one universal language? And if so, what was it? What was used for our ancestors to communicate with incoming foreigners that were arriving upon these lands? And how did the English language become the primary language spoken, opposed to the many indigenous languages that already existed here in America? Well, before I reveal the answers to those questions, let's take a look at the so-called history of language and how it became what it is today. Now, there are some people who would equate language and its creation to the Phoenicians, due to the many stories of these same said people being the actual creators of the alphabet. According to the Encyclopedia of Trade from Ancient Times to Present,
let's go back.
most of the world...
Earlier, I was talking about the Anunnaki, right? I'm talking about the Anunnaki, right?
Now, there are some people who would equate language and its creation to the Phoenicians, due to the many stories of these same said people being the actual creators of the alphabet. According to the Encyclopedia of Trade from Ancient Times to Present, most of the world's writing systems before the invention of the alphabet were pictograms, such as the Egyptian hieroglyphics. An alphabet is an important cultural innovation that allows easy and therefore potential mass literacy, more accurate record and contract keeping, adaptability to new intellectual concepts, and thus accelerated cultural change. The Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, and Cyrillic alphabets all derived ultimately from the Phoenician, end quote. But what is very important to note here is that it also states that the Phoenicians are the ancestors to which all Western alphabets can be traced, but it is not the ancestor of all languages. And that is because an alphabet does not produce the language. It only provides a symbol for the oral sound that a person makes when speaking a particular language. The word language is derived from the Latin word lingua, which means the tongue and speech. It is defined in the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary as, quote, human speech, the expression of ideas by words or significant articulate sounds for the communication of thoughts, end quote. So, who are the Phoenicians? And why were they so important to the history of language? The Phoenicians knew that language was a very important part of trade. And before they allegedly created the alphabet, people wrote in cuneiform or pictograms, which could transcribe an entire idea versus just one word. This means that someone would have to be very educated, or rather indoctrinated, in order to produce these types of writings. And because they were known for traveling and expanding their trading empire all across Europe and Northern Africa, they knew how important it was to have a simpler means of communication, especially due to their mainland being a port city along the Mediterranean Sea, allegedly located in what is called Lebanon today. And so the Phoenician city of Byblos became an epicenter for trade. According to the Ancient History Encyclopedia, Byblos was the religious capital of Phoenicia, and papyrus was one of its principal articles of trade. For this reason, quote, the Greeks took the name of the city as their word for book, Byblos, and from their word for books named our word for Bible, ta Biblia, which means the books. Byblos was an important shipping port known for its timbers. The cedars of Lebanon was said to be prized by other countries because it was the first city to allegedly perfect shipbuilding. The Phoenicians carried a trade route and created colonies in what is now known as Spain, France, Italy, and Northern Africa. And while traveling to different locations meant learning different languages and written scripts, which in fact took time to study and understand, the Phoenicians allegedly decided to come up with the 22 symbols that we recognize today as an alphabet. It was understood that every word that can be spoken is comprised of different sounds placed together. The Phoenicians realized that 22 sounds make up the majority of words, so they created easy to write and easy to recall symbols that anyone can learn to match with these sounds. It was also said that every one of these sounds were consonants, but many of these sounds were in fact vowel sounds disguised as a consonant symbol or letter. And many of these letters have since expanded into what is now known as the English alphabet. This is why you will find a few letters of the English alphabet having the same exact sounds and symbols, and in some cases having the same sound with different symbols. For some mysterious reason, the English alphabet has a few repeating sounds, in which a new symbol was created for each one, bringing the total amount of letters used in the English alphabet to 26, and the French and Spanish alphabet includes one additional letter, bringing their totals to 27. Now, why is this important, you ask? Well, just as the Phoenicians were traders that traveled and created colonies, so were the English, Spanish, and the French. So in other words, all of these languages are in fact trade languages, in which each of these trade languages were eventually passed down from generation to generation over time. But in a more historical sense, these trade languages were better known as pidgin languages. A pidgin language is described today as a language with no native speakers, which is used for business, trade, or commerce. It is the reduced form of a language. But if there were no native speakers, then what language is it reduced from? A lingua franca. A lingua franca, from Italian, meaning Frankish tongue, is a language systematically used as a common language to bridge the communication of those people that speak different native languages. English is a dramatic bridge language or a trade language with an added mixture of Spanish words, French words, Greek, Arabic, Latin, and it also heavily incorporates words from the many American Indian indigenous languages that were once spoken upon these lands, now known as the Americas. A lingua franca takes many words and their meanings or ideas and reduces them into a simplified version that could be understood by many. Lingua franca literally means Frankish tongue, a language spoken in Germany, that eventually evolved into the language now known as Dutch. What is also very important to note here is that pidgin languages and lingua francas claim to have no native speakers, but that is very far from the truth. The process, which is used to simplify a language, also seeks to reduce the origin of the word spoken. But if you simply follow the word trail based on the sound of a word, the origin of that word usually shows up with a different spelling attached or a very closely related meaning that is often stated with, not to be confused with, etc. Or the origin of that word could be closely related in meaning and just misunderstood. For example, the indigenous word water sounds like water, but this word actually means canoe, which is a boat that sits in the water. So pointing at the canoe in the water and saying water could have been mistaken by a foreigner as the liquid that was surrounding the canoe, and yet it is now our English word for water. Many languages are in fact the same language, hidden behind different spelling and reversed grammar, misunderstood but closely related in meanings, and spoken with different pronunciations and different dialects. So now, this should make you ask some questions, like, how did we as a people begin to take on the English language as our primary language? And how did the English language become the official but yet non-official language of North America, instead of the many indigenous tongues that were spoken before the colonization of this land? It was implemented through a process called polysynthesis. Polysynthesis is comprised of two terms, poly and synthesis. Poly meaning many or much, and synthesis meaning deductive reasoning, to put together or to combine. The linguistic definition of this word was coined by a French-American linguist by the name of Peter Stephen Duponcho in the year of 1816, and according to the 9th volume of the North American Review and Miscellaneous Journal that was published in the year 1819, Duponcho defines polysynthesis as, quote, the act of taking the greatest number of ideas and comprising them into the least number of words. Peter Duponcho immigrated to North America during the year of 1777 and became well known for his linguistics analysis of the indigenous languages of America, spoken by the Indians. Peter Duponcho even wrote a book on the grammatical systems of the Indian languages. This book, prized by the Institutes of France, was called Mémoire sur le système grammatical de langue de quelqu'unes sous genre de l'imaginaire, or rather translated in English as the memory of the grammatical system of the languages of some Indian nations of North America, which was published in the year of 1838. It was known since the earliest days of colonization that Indians had a very rich vocabulary. It was stated in the North American Review that, quote, Indians have an innumerable quantity of words. To the testimony of Mr. Duponcho and of Colden, we can add that of Roger Williams, who says in the most emphatic terms that the language of the Indians is exceedingly copious, and they have 5 or 6 words, sometimes for one thing. This was obviously a major issue in terms of trade, and so prominent anthropologists like Franz Boas, Melville Herskovitz, and even Margaret Mead eagerly studied some of the indigenous languages of America in hopes of using the process of polysynthesis in order to royally change these indigenous languages indefinitely. Listen closely. Polysynthesis not only simplifies a language, but it also carries a hidden agenda to systematically alter and even remove a language completely. It was done so in a matter of familiarity. Even nowadays, we as a people do not create new words to convey a slang word or a new word. It's just usually a commonly known word that is used that somehow finds its way into having an alternate meaning or definition. According to the American Anthropologist, Volume 6, that was published in October of 1893, when talking about polysynthesis in English languages, the writer stated, quote, "I know by experience how difficult it is for a missionary to convey to the minds of his hearers certain religious ideas. Again and again did I try, when missionary to the Ponca Indians, to find the proper Indian word for kingdom in order to make an even approximate translation of the petition, 'Thy kingdom come.' Anyone who has lived amongst Indians know the worthlessness of adducing modern names, i.e., names of objects introduced among the Indians since the arrival of the white race on this continent, for the purpose of illustrating the construct of an Indian language," end quote. It was also well known by these anthropologists that I mentioned earlier, and even the ones that were in between, that by reducing the amount of words to one's vocabulary will cause a chain reaction that would in turn reduce the amount of ideas one may be able to produce, creating a generalized dumbing down effect on the population, and especially on the students that received this type of education. For example, an American anthropologist and one of the direct students of the famous German descent American anthropologist named Melville Herskovitz, a name that you may recall me mentioning on numerous occasions, along with presenting his story to everyone in my previous documentaries, by the name of Margaret Mead, speaks about this during an interview on Social Anthropology, American Character, and Primitive Studies that was conducted and produced by Howard Langer in 1959. During this interview with Margaret Mead, she stated that the usage and learning a different language other than the trade language of English is suppressed, and that this is taught to our children at a young age by the systematic usage of polysynthesis. She also shared a very essential example on how it is all done.
We train people not to be able to learn foreign languages in the most fantastic way, because what we teach a child is, you see, if you take this pencil here, we teach a child this is a pencil. Now this isn't a pencil. This is an object made of wood and lead, designed for writing, which we call a pencil, and other people call it other things, 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 and other people call it other things.
So, this type of so-called educational training, which has been implemented within our public compulsory educational institutions' curriculums for several years now, successfully ensured that the English language became the primary language of nearly all households throughout America. And as the indigenous languages of the American Indians has since been royally reduced, it must be understood that this form of systematic indoctrination of our children has been unfortunately mutually consented by the descendants of the indigenous people of America, us. The entire purpose of sending our children to school is so that they could participate in the act of industry and trade by getting a good job. Although there are no existing legislators that list English as the official language of the United States, the transition from the indigenous languages that were once spoken to the English language was a systematic effort brought about to ensure business efficiency and that the trade ran more smoothly. On March 3, 1819, Congress passed an act making provision for the civilization of the Indian tribes adjoining the frontier settlements. It is very important to note that the word frontier is, quote, the border or confine of a country that is furthest advanced with a part that fronts an enemy or which an invading enemy meets at front, end quote. This act of 1819 states, quote, that for the purpose of providing against the further decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes adjoining the frontier settlements of the United States, and for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization, the President of the United States shall be, and he is hereby authorized in every case where he shall judge improvement in the inhabitants and condition of such Indians practicable, and that the means of instruction can be introduced with their own consent, to employ capable persons of good moral character, to instruct them in the mode of agriculture suited to their situation, and for teaching their children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and performing such other duties as may be enjoined, according to such instructions and rules as the President may give and prescribe for the regulation of their conduct in the discharge of their duties. End quote. Those indigenous families that accepted education and employment did so under the guise of civilization. So, where did this idea come from? Well, it could have came in response to the pleas of President Jefferson to the American Indian chiefs upon this land. According to the address made to Indian chiefs by Thomas Jefferson during the early 1800s, pleas were made for the tribes to go into business of trade and industry with the incoming foreigners, stating that those who accepted employment as, quote, cultivators of the earth for the maintenance of their families, those people would be supporting their families better and with less labor. They were assured that by raising stock and bread and by spinning and weaving clothes than by hunting, that more provisions will be provided, and that a woman will clothe more by spinning and weaving than a man by hunting, end quote. Thomas Jefferson also stated that, quote, compared with you, we are but as of yesterday in this land. Yet see how much more we have multiplied by industry and the exercise of that reason which you possess in common with us. Follow then our example, brethren, and we will aid you with great pleasure, end quote. So, by sending our children to school and preparing them for the workforce and capitalism and industry, it was thought that we would somehow be excelling to a greater level in life. But this was actually the beginning of slavery here in America for those who were not yet prisoners of war. And we cannot get to this point without adopting a common language that was familiar and foreign at the same time. Or so we thought, because there was in fact a universal language of trade already in use. Before interpreters and before foreigners could fully understand the indigenous language upon this land, and before the mixture of German and Indian languages that created English, what was used amongst our ancestors to communicate with incoming foreigners that were arriving upon these lands? The universal language available that was used to conduct trade in America amongst the Indians and foreigners during that time is the same language that is used with babies and young children before they could speak the language of adults. It's the same language used in sports amongst referees and umpires. It is the same language used between a baseball pitcher and a baseball catcher. It's the same language used in secret organizations and amongst law enforcement officials. It is the very same language that you would use if you were somewhere that you could not speak, the language that was commonly understood. This language is known universally as sign language. And according to the handbook of the church's missions to the Indians, entered at the post office of Harvard, Connecticut in 1854, but published in March of 1913, quote, Sign language was of extensive development and existed all over the world and bore a resemblance to the sign language now used in some of our deaf-mute schools. Picture writing the world over probably grew out of sign language, the first stage in development. The second was pictographs, and the third, alphabet. These merge into each other by a slow and gradual process. End quote. It is unfortunate that the sign language is the common language of mainly the deaf and the mute today, and that is no longer widely understood as it was before, when it was used widely amongst those who conducted trade upon these lands. It too is one of the Indian languages that is now in danger of becoming extinct. And some may say for a very good reason, because it has been said that written language and spoken language was developed to hide one's true intent. And when we are focused so much on what is being said or what was written, we just might miss the signs. I'm just here to make.
There y'all go. Now y'all know a little bit truth of who and where we come from. See that badass light skinned native? Look like one of my own ladies. You look just like my lady. She like my daughter. I just, like I said, I want y'all to wake the fuck up. Y'all must see this. It's a must that y'all see these things. You know what I'm saying? That's like with them trying that one world currency shit. Um, it's already completed. Everything is card. You drop some more knowledge for y'all.